of new people coming in.
You've transitioned from being a reporter covering stories to now being a columnist. Your column called Outpost is on the New York Times website. What's that been like for you? I have to admit that I've kind of dipped my toe in the blog world, and as a traditional reporter, I get nervous anytime it feels like an opinion of mine might be seeping out, and I pull back. What's that been like for you, sharing your opinions with people?
Well, you and I are the same way. I was very nervous when I started writing this column, and I actually tried it out last summer to see if I could do it. I wasn't sure if I could be someone who has to build, an entire essay around a point of view. And it's dangerous, and it's liberating, and it's ultimately kind of exhilarating. Because the way that it works with the New York Times is when you file a story, you go through a whole layer, very many layers of editors until it finally ends up in the paper. And we're very careful, we try to be very careful about having professional standards upheld. With a column, you're basically on your own. You can say whatever you want as long as it doesn't, cost the newspaper, libel somebody. Yeah. And especially this year, where there's so much interest in politics and who's going to be the next president, and how many senators will be replaced if they're replaced. And it's just a fabulous year to be alive and be commenting on, the elections in politics. So I thought I would have a shortage of material. I have too much. I mean, my column ideas can fill several notebooks. And I'm trying to make it stay in the West and not just be a Beltway gas bag. There's this pull of watching these cable shows and getting mad at Chris Matthews or something. And I'm trying to keep it sort of reporter-based too.
How do you choose? You cover 11 Western states. As you mentioned, you've got notebooks full. Are there certain stories columns that drive you more than any others?
There are certain things. Not long ago I wrote about, which is sort of not a Western thing, but I wrote about college and endowments and how much it costs and how these colleges are hoarding their endowments. And it was sort of, I wanted to time it with everybody, every kid going to the mailbox to see if they're getting their acceptance thing, and every parent realizing it's going to cost them at least $40,000 a year to go to any private college in the United States. And there was sort of an outrage factor there, as how dare this outstrip the cost of inflation so much at a time when most colleges have these huge endowments. So that was a timing thing. I'm starting to write now about national parks a lot. There's been a decline in visitorship, and some of the parks are in terrible shape, and there's a big debate on whether Americans are losing their love affair with national parks because it's sort of coinciding with the summer and people getting outdoors again. So I try to time it with interest level too.
The land is very important to you. I know that from your book, The Good Rain, about this area. And it's important for you as a Westerner to kind of blow out some of the stereotypes that Easterners and other people may have of the West, and really, really remind people about the attachment to the land here.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because that is, when I first wrote The Good Rain, my idea was I wanted to write somewhat of a history told from the point of view of the land, not the point of view of great men, railroad barons. Histories are usually told by these people who end up as statues, or told by the people who were around the statues before they were statues. And I thought, as I thought about the Northwest, I thought our story really is something that's from, these great rivers, the largest river in the West, the Columbia River, and how it influenced both agriculture and power. And you could make an argument that World War II was largely won because of the Columbia River and the power that was generated from that to build the B-17s, and the nuclear bomb came from that. And our fights are over that too. Our fights are over those. So I try to do that. The other thing you mentioned, Marcia, which is on this column, is yeah, people do have a lot of stereotypes about the West. I mean, in Idaho in particular, people think it's full of wackos still and everybody's a cowboy. That's changing among the intelligentsia, the people who are in the know and people in the tech world. But there's still a lot of these things. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is just poke the balloon of conventional wisdom.
Well, one of the things you've been writing a lot about is politics, and in particular lately, Democratic politics. For a while, Tim, it was a given that the Rocky Mountain West was absorbing some of the most conservative immigrants or transplants from other states, and who wanted to get away from multiculturalism in the schools and government interference. And yet, you wrote a column that got a lot of comments from around the world on Obama's visit here.
Right.
And have written other columns about the changing West. What are you seeing out here? I know you feel that some of the states out here will be players in the presidential election.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. When the history of this 2008 campaign is written, I think Obama's visit to Boise, Idaho, and filling the Taco Bell Arena, as everyone likes to say because it sounds funny outside of Idaho, is going to be much more than an asterisk and much more than a paragraph. Because as Obama said when he visited, they told me there were no Democrats out here. And what's happened is there's sort of conventional wisdom that the West would change as people fled bigger cities, California, as you mentioned. Well, that first wave that came was more conservative. We know that from the polling now, that they were fleeing, in some cases, not all, but in some cases they were fleeing ethnic diversity, the increasing Latinos in the South, that sort of thing. But then the second wave is different. The second wave that came tends to be more who cares, they're more independent, they're less partisan.
A lot of entrepreneurship.
Exactly, exactly. And they're more sort of socially liberal in the sense of leave me alone, who cares what you're doing in your private life, that sort of thing. They're less religious, they tend to be more secular. This is just what all the polling shows. And you started to see it 2 years ago when Colorado flipped from a Republican governor to a Democratic governor. Montana flipped, put in a Democratic senator. In Idaho, you have a Senate race and a congressional race that'll really be important to the rest of the country. We'll be watching it. And it's a result of these demographic changes that different kinds of people are now moving. Now, I'm not saying they'll be Democratic.
Right.
I'm saying they'll be more independent.
Could
and
we
it
see,
will change the mix.
Could we see a vice president selection from either party from the West?
I think it's very possible that we could see a vice president from either party from, well, there's a long list and I don't want to name it and date myself if I end up saying the wrong thing, but yeah, there's probably on the short list maybe 3 people on the Democratic side from the West. I can think of 3 governors who are in play, and on the Republican side at least 1 governor.
Governor
Palin of Alaska.
Palin of Alaska, who's an Idaho graduate.
As I keep hearing, she's an Idaho graduate, exactly.
Governor of?
Governor Napolitano of Arizona on the Democratic side, very popular Democrat, just won their 2nd term 2 years ago, carried every county in the state of Arizona, every legislative district, former prosecutor. She may actually end up as an attorney general if a Democrat ends up being the president. Schweitzer of Montana, who's thought of as sort of the pioneer of the new Western Democrats, that talks like a Democrat, talks like a Westerner, but is a Democrat. He's certainly one of the people on the short list as well.
Potentially a governor from the former Dust Bowl, Kansas.
Exactly.
Sebelius.
Governor Sebelius, exactly.
One thing that has changed, you and I both covered the resource wars here, and there was a militia movement, and there was a lot of consternation about cutbacks in logging and mining. That seems to have died down. I've always viewed it somewhat also as a class situation, as an economic situation. But that's one change that has happened over the last decade is, the threats against Forest Service folks and BLM folks seem to have abated a bit. Yeah,
not just the threats against them, but the rancor over the whole issue in general. I mean, this was a war that caused the President of the United States to hold a summit. I mean, don't forget there was a timber summit in Portland, Oregon, early in Bill Clinton's presidency, because supposedly it was like he was, bringing the 2 sides together from Ireland or something like that. It was really awful, as you know. People were really at each other's throat, and part of it was a class thing. I've seen it not quite disappear, but really change, in that some of these towns have changed. They've become tourist towns, or they've become high energy towns, or they've become second home towns. Others have realized they're going to get their timber from privately owned lands, and therefore the forest lands aren't the source of that. And I think there's a general consensus view that recreational use, particularly here in southern Idaho, is a key, if not the key, quote, multiple use of many public lands. I mean, in the mountain biking generation and the cross-country skiing generation, people love these public lands for recreation, and that's almost superseded the extractive purpose.
Well, certainly a very fascinating time to be covering public affairs in the West. You're right in the thick of it. You have a front seat. So,
yeah, I sort of pinch myself because it really is. I mean, not only is, like I say, the West in play, but there's so much going on here right now, too.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and our viewers. You've been listening to Tim Egan. Mr. Egan is an award-winning book writer, but he's also a columnist for the New York Times, and we will be linking to sites about his books and to his columns on our website, so be sure to check that out. And as usual, thanks for tuning into Dialogue. We hope you'll join us same time next week. Thank you very much.
Great stuff.